Today's guest is Sergey Nazarov. He's the co-founder of Chainlink, and Chainlink operates as a bridge between blockchains and the outside world. Its core business is effectively bringing data on-chain. Sergey's been active in crypto policy discussions in DC and attended the White House's first ever crypto summit last month. Sergey, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So we like to ask our guests this question every time we start. What does crypto in America mean to you?
I think it means the future of the U.S. financial system, which is one of the main defining qualities of what makes the United States kind of global superpower.
I like that. I think in terms of making the U.S. that, I feel like it already is kind of that, though. So what about crypto really enhances it? Because I'm calling in from New York, which is arguably one of, if not the financial capital of the world. Maybe I'm biased. But what about crypto kind of enables it to go to that next step?
What generally happens in the financial system is you have a reformatting of how transactions and contracts and everything works. So how contract settlement works, how transactions work. The last reformatting of the global financial system was when you went from paper to databases and the internet. So everything before was transacted by paper. And then in the 70s and 80s, you had something called the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation formed. And you had a transition where databases became available and the internet then became available and web servers became available. So the financial system in the US and globally was previously on paper, and then it moved to servers and the internet, right? And so in that transition, the US financial system gained a lot of share. It gained a lot of market share in the global financial system for a few reasons. One of the reasons is the size of its domestic market, which is large. Another reason is it has a good legal system that can actually reliably allow you to put in capital and be assured that you will retain the ownership of that capital. You'll have relatively little fraud and so on. And then another big reason was that internet infrastructure and kind of database infrastructure was very far ahead in the US. So if you went into the internet and the database and the server world in the early 90s or the late 80s, and you compared the state of internet infrastructure and database technologies and server technologies in the US with Europe or Asia, the US would be 5 years ahead of Europe and maybe 10 plus years ahead of Asia. And so it's very natural that you had very innovative firms like E-Trade, Interactive Brokers, a whole bunch of really innovative financial services, financial products. You have iShares from BlackRock. You have all these different things that appear in kind of the internet age of the financial system. And coupled with the domestic market and coupled with the highly reliable legal system, you have also the internet acting as distribution and acting as a gateway for the acquisition of more assets that are managed and issued and powered by U.S. financial services. In fact, financial services makes up a very significant part of the U.S. economy because of this, because in that paper to internet transition, the U.S. had a very big lead from a technical point of view, and it had this reliable aspect of the financial markets, which is what regulators are responsible for, and it had a big domestic market. Now what you're going to have, and what's already happening, is a transition from the traditional financial system on internet rails and servers and databases into the global financial system and the US financial system into blockchain-based, blockchain format transactions. And so the blockchain industry and the Oracle network industry and the smart contract industry right now is kind of about the early stages of what this is all about. So in the internet analogy, there was a period when the internet was about email. And that was the main use case of the internet. And if you talk to people about the internet, they would be like, that's email. And it was kind of synonymous. In our industry today, if you talk to people about blockchains and Oracle networks and smart contracts, they'll say that's cryptocurrencies. That's what that is. But that is just the very early iteration of what our technology in our industry does. The next iteration is the reformatting of the current internet-based financial system into the blockchain-based financial system.
Sergey, you've spent a lot of time in DC, and we'll get into all of that as well. But just looking further down the road, or perhaps not that far down the road, as it seems to be coming up relatively soon, maybe in the next couple of weeks, market structure legislation. Are you concerned at all that lawmakers may not be getting the DeFi aspect right in the market structure right now? I know that takes a little bit more work. How have your meetings been going with lawmakers on the Hill? Do they seem open to putting carve-outs in for DeFi? Do you feel like DeFi is going to get treated fairly in market structure legislation that we may be seeing in a couple of weeks' time?
So the conversations in DC have been going very well. DC can only focus, in my experience now that I've had some experience, on 1, 2, or maybe 3 issues at a time on any given topic, because there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen between the different congressmen, the different senators, the different regulators, and everyone. One of the interesting things that I've noticed about DC relative to the other governments we've worked with, because we work with many central banks all over the world, the other central banks are usually all in one building. So the regulator, the treasury, the federal, everybody's in one building. And I'm just going to back and forth to the same building, different floors of the building.
Yeah, not in the US though.
In the US, funnily enough, in a compatible way with our industry, it's actually the most decentralized government that I've
fragmented.
I mean, fragmented is one word, but in line with kind of the ethos of our industry, it is actually a very decentralized model of government, is what I've realized. That's not something that people seem to think about much, but in terms of the intent of the founders and what the actual way the system is supposed to work, it is actually very decentralized. When you look at it, the whole system is trying to create a certain level of decentralization in how government works, checks and balances, all this stuff. So I just found that interesting. But it leads to a certain bandwidth constraint where you can only consider a few issues at once. And so the issues under consideration now are stable coins and market structure. I think market structure will partly cover on some DeFi topics, but won't fully address them. I think stablecoin legislation shouldn't address DeFi topics and doesn't need to address market structure. That should just be done so that the US can catch up with other stablecoin legislation in other countries. Today, I think it was actually announced that there's going to be a proof of bill. And we've been in many conversations with various senators and congressmen about proof of reserves, which Chainlink is the largest technology provider for. And so now there's this proof of bill out there, and it's coming in, and actually now 2 congressmen and senators and others are now actually putting it out there themselves.
Can I just cut in there? I just want to tell our listeners what the proof of bill is. And that is a bill introduced by Senator Tom Tillis and Senator Hickenlooper. It's a bipartisan bill. It was actually first introduced in 2023. And basically the crux of it is it would ban crypto custodians from commingling customer funds. And then to your point, Sergey, also comply with monthly reserve inspections. And the point of it was basically to stop another FTX disaster from happening. So lots of support behind that bill, I would imagine.
Yeah. Lots of support. That's an example of a topic we've been discussing with folks in DC, and we've been working on getting some updates to the stablecoin proof of reserve section, and we've been working on, a larger, wider proof of reserves effort. This bill is a bit focused on centralized exchanges and some other custodian-related things, but we actually expect more proof of reserves things around both DeFi protocols, stablecoins, all kinds of different asset types, right? So I think the thing that I'm seeing in DC is that they're focused on 2 or 3 issues. They're actually trying to get them done before the August recess, like stable coins and market structure. Market structure will partly touch on DeFi. I think the problem with DeFi is categorizing it. And I don't think you're actually going to be able to categorize something in the current regulatory frameworks as quote unquote DeFi. I think what you'll have is the existing separations between the SEC and the CFTC start to take shape around categories of DeFi, and the OCC under the Treasury, for example, for banking related things. And so DeFi is a term that we have that's a very kind of umbrella term that covers lots of different financial services and products. But in the government's view, I think what they'll do is they'll pull it apart as to, there's DeFi activity related to banking. There's DeFi activity related to derivatives. There's DeFi activity related to trading, lending, different topics. And so those different groups within the US system will have to create definition. Some of that will be done through legislation, like market structure, the market structure bill and others. Some of it will be done through what's called rulemaking, which is basically where the regulator comes along and defines some rules through guidance. with this current SEC, I think rulemaking in many ways is going to be faster. And we're in conversations with regulators in the US, all kinds of regulators all over the world. And we are actually, in many cases, sometimes the largest consumer of their sandboxes and regulatory frameworks. In many cases, in some cases, doing the most transactions from our industry in those sandboxes and frameworks. For example, we did the most transactions in the Singapore Guardian framework at the end of this past year, which is one of the leading frameworks. And so now what we're doing with the US regulators is we're showing them the different framework options, and we're trying to get them to a place where they have a better framework. And that'll help DeFi, that'll help speed along guidance. So I think DeFi is one of the things that's next. I think right now it's stablecoins, basic market structure, which hopefully will make institutions in the US more comfortable to do tokenization. There's now this proof of act, which is something that we've been kind of pushing as an idea in general, the fact that you need more proof of reserves on chain, the fact that you want to go from an annual audit cycle to a real-time audit cycle, because that basically protects consumers, creates better perfect information in the market, and is actually just better for the issuers and custodians that actually are doing the right thing. So these are all topics we're in discussion with different congressmen, senators, regulators on. It's going extremely well. I'm spending myself every month so far this year. I've been in DC for an extended period of time, so it's very active. And I think the other thing about DC is that the U.S. is a super regulator. So what is going to happen is as DC creates this guidance and these laws, the rest of the financial system globally will get massively accelerated from that. Because I think that the blockchain industry and the decentralized application DeFi industry is one of those industries that's actually not being deglobalized. It's one of the few industries that's continuing to become more and more globalized.
If you've been in the space for a while, you know that crypto is not going anywhere. Governments are talking about Bitcoin reserves, traditional finance is moving on-chain, and if we're building for the long term, we need tech that's fast, reliable, and ready for everyday use. That's where our sponsor, Avalanche, comes in. It's a super fast blockchain network designed for builders, degens, businesses, and institutions. That's why JP Morgan, Citibank, BlackRock, Deloitte, Off the Grid, Sports Illustrated, and more are already using Avalanche. Want to learn more? Join us at the upcoming Avalanche Summit in London on May 20th through the 22nd. Hear directly from leading voices in the Avalanche ecosystem and learn more about the blockchain network driving Web3 adoption. Secure your ticket at avalanchesummitlondon.com. See you there.
And Sergey, I want to ask you about that. You know, you mentioned sort of interacting with other frameworks in other jurisdictions. You mentioned sort of the decentralization of the U.S. regulation system. And I was curious because MiCA actually left out a lot more maybe than it included, right? Like you mentioned sort of not needing comprehensive market structure all at once here in the United States. MiCA didn't address things like staking, very kind of light touch, if at all, on sort of DeFi overall. What do you think are some of those elements that the U.S. can maybe borrow in terms of pushing as the leader globally from some of those other frameworks? Like, what would you like to see adopted here around some of the areas that we're discussing?
Sure. I think one of the first things that you really need, and Hester Peirce has talked about this quite a bit in the past, is a sandbox environment where institutions and various firms that take compliance seriously, which is basically all the firms you want tokenizing in the US, to have a special environment where they can do pilots and they can do initial implementations under a compliance regime that they expect will lead to production compliance, right? So right now, the US doesn't have a general sandbox or a general framework to do compliant tokenization of real estate or funds or equities or commodities in a way where an institution like JP Morgan or an institution like State Street or an institution like Fidelity can go and address all of their compliance department's concerns by saying, we're doing it in this framework. We've been promised that nothing can go wrong legally. Please, for the love of God, would you finally let us do the tokenization that we know the market wants us to do? So, and this has been a topic that Hester and as a commissioner and others there have already been pushing quite a bit. So that's good. It doesn't exist yet. Hopefully that'll exist. The thing with MiCA, just so you know, is that was done during the regulatory, let's say, dark ages. the dark times, when doing anything at all positive towards crypto was a big risk, was a big political risk, it was a big reputational risk, it was a big career risk. And those are really some of the three main risks that a lot of people in the regulatory world think about. They also think about the risk of stifling the economy. They think about the risk to consumers. But now the US, I think, has kind of made it acceptable in the regulatory community to provide clear guidance. And so I think the sandbox framework is good. I think that should extend to DeFi. I think it should extend beyond just institutional interactions with tokenization. It should allow some of the more advanced DeFi things to be possible in that sandbox and framework, just from an experimentation point of view, so that those pilots can be done and we can come back and we can show that to the regulator and we can say, hey, look, we did this pilot and we can comply, even if it's DeFi. And these pilots are something that the Chainlink community and me personally are very experienced at doing. We've done, I don't know, tens to maybe some point soon, probably approaching hundreds of these things at some point. So these pilots are often what open the door to work with regulators, banks, asset managers, and so on. And, I don't think we've done hundreds. I think we've done tens, and we're probably going to end up doing hundreds. We've probably done the most pilots of anyone, if I had to guess right now, with various banks all over the world. So I think that framework and sandbox is very important. I think stablecoin legislation is very important.
What about in Asia, Sergey? I know Chainlink had their conference there in the fall in Hong Kong. Maybe there was a decision related to that into expanding in that market over there. But how do you think about like the regulatory space in Asia? You talked about MiCA in Europe, and then obviously we've discussed the US, and I'm sure we'll get back to the US. But Asia, what's your take on it?
My take that it's in terms of our industry, it's been much more progressive. And when all the crypto teams and DeFi teams left the US, the vast majority of them didn't go to Switzerland because the European regulatory environment was not was more favorable, was not significantly more favorable. They went to Asia. They went to Singapore. They went to Hong Kong. And so it's not a coincidence that our conference last year was in Hong Kong, and that the undersecretary of the regulator there was speaking at our conference, and that I was speaking with them on stage actually the year before at our conference. And that, there was this growth of DeFi. There was kind of like a DeFi boom in Asia. Why actually a lot of other crypto projects did their conferences there. And that's partly really to the credit of folks like the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who we work very closely with and who we did all those pilots in that I mentioned at the end of last year. And also the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, who's also very favorable towards our industry. It's provided clear guidance and has enabled a lot of innovation there. And now you have, Singapore firms and Hong Kong firms transacting with each other, tokenizing things and innovating on how to do that. And that's basically what the US should be afraid of. That's what they should be worried about. What they should be worried about is that JP Morgan and UBS and everybody is doing it not in the US, that they're doing it in clear frameworks with clear legal guidance, with clear regulatory guidance, in sandboxes and frameworks, not in the US. But everyone wants to do it in the US. So just to be very clear, when I speak to the people that report to the CEOs of these banks, I'm in conversations now at almost like the board level and the CEOs of like the top 4 or 5 banks in the world, the people that report to them. Those are the people that I'm now in conversations with about their next stage of their plans and what's going to happen. And their fundamental problem is they can't tokenize something in the US system, but they can tokenize something in the Singapore system or the Hong Kong system. But I don't want to be negative. This is really a consequence of the previous regulatory regime. This is in no way related to the people that have now been trying to save and help and fix things over the last 3 or 4 months. And people like David Sachs and Bo Hines at the White House, people like Hester Peirce at the SEC, Caroline Pham at the CFTC, all these different folks now have a green light to just really fix this problem. And I do see them fixing it. And I do see them very rapidly fixing it. So, I just want to be clear that this is a completely fixable and salvageable situation. And the US regulators are doing now, I think, a very good job moving things in the right direction. It's really night and day, right? We didn't take a 90-degree turn here. We turned around with the other way, right? We did a 180-degree turn from kill stable coins, avoid everything related to Bitcoin, make it illegal, to we have to support this industry. It's a critical part of the economy. Let's go sit with the president on public TV and talk about it.
Sergey, I know that Chainlink is a global company, and you guys also have operations in the US. Were there ever points where you thought of just throwing the rag in and leaving prior to the positive 180 you just mentioned?
So Chainlink has a very big community, and the people that work on Chainlink directly at the core level and at integrations and other places are actually distributed all over the world. So just to kind of answer your question, this isn't a decision I have to make because I didn't concentrate or our community didn't concentrate the key people that build Chainlink in the US. There are a lot of key people in the US that do build Chainlink, and a big portion of our community is here. And, I'm a US citizen and I want to see the US succeed. And I'm very actively working with DC, and I'm, the executive branch and legislative branch and all these different groups, the regulators. And yeah, I think Chainlink was immune from this kind of from the beginning, because Chainlink is a truly kind of global open source community driven thing. It's not it's like these open source projects that are not concentrated in one place. So it wasn't really an issue for us by design from the beginning. But I was definitely looking at it and saying, this is not going to be good for the US. And now I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying there's a chance that all the advantages the US has with the domestic market, the reliable market structure that they have in the traditional world, that they can leverage that to get a global leadership position in the Web3 financial system.
Let's go back to the White House for a second, Sergey. We do want to talk to you about your experience at the Crypto Summit, but I also want to get your take on the rule or the law that was signed into, let me start that again. Sorry. I do want to get your take on the bill that was signed into law by President Trump recently that stated that DeFi software developers do not have to comply with IRS tax reporting rules. Can you explain a little bit how that's beneficial to a company like Chainlink and to your users? I think there was some confusion among people who saw this headline as this was the first cryptocurrency bill signed into law by President Trump, but they didn't really understand how it would benefit them. From a DeFi perspective and from Chainlink's perspective, and yours, of course, can you just explain to our audience what that means?
Yeah, I think at a high level, what has been happening in the past is folks in the legal system of the US and in various agencies were collaborating to try and slow down our industry and to make it unsuccessful under the belief that if they made it unsuccessful in the US, it would fail globally. That belief, by the way, never made sense. All it did was it shifted whatever success the industry would have outside the United States. And so you had a number of strange pronouncements from various agencies and regulators and different folks in the government that basically were, from my view, like some kind of collaboration between them and others somewhere else in the government to kind of put wheels in the spokes of our industry and just slow it down. It didn't slow our industry down, by the way. All it did was it made it move outside of the US system. That's all it did. And I think what these types of things are by the president and the executive branch are basically the unwinding of those decisions. And the reason those decisions are being unwinded, along with many other decisions, I mean, you can see the amount of decisions being unwinded from the previous, administration and their choices on many topics. So I think this is just part of that whole unwinding of previous decisions trend. And in this case, the unwinding of this decision is encouraging because you don't have additional regulations you need to comply with. If you as a DeFi protocol do transactions in the US system with US users within the US financial system, right? And so what that does is it just eliminates one additional hurdle that a DeFi protocol was thinking about when they were asking themselves, do I want to work in the US financial system of Web3? And that's what it does. And I expect more of these, but from my point of view, it's more of this kind of unwinding.
Yeah. Sergey, I want to ask, you made a couple of interesting points there about, similar decision processes that, folks I've dealt with or even people at Say have dealt with in the past, right? Where we considered, is there somewhere else to go, but you're pretty decentralized as an organization. Now with that shift, it does seem like there's a whole lot of value or emphasis on folks coming back, right? Even if you never really left, trying to establish that foothold here in the States. We've had Miles Jennings discuss the Duno with us. We've had a couple of different novel proposed structures in the United States. You've seen several organizations. Say just launched the Say Development Foundation as a U.S. foundation. We've seen Solana come in, Solana Policy Institute with slightly different goals. Have you guys, or has anyone in the Chainlink community ever thought about establishing, something more of a foothold in order to kind of directly, work in the U.S. or work more closely with policymakers? How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, we definitely have a foothold in DC. So we're very active there. We're doing lots of events, talking to congressmen, senators, in lots of meetings with regulators. So we, and myself personally, are investing a lot of time in helping, let's say, fix the issues that happened in the past and get on a good trajectory for stablecoins, our industry in general, and DeFi specifically, since Chainlink does power the majority of DeFi, right? So that is an industry that we care about. That's the industry that allowed Chainlink to boom and grow into what it is today. I think in addition to DeFi, what will happen next for Chainlink is the institutional side will probably be the next chapter, and the interaction of DeFi and institutional world together will probably be kind of, I would say, the final chapter of our whole industry, in which I hope Chainlink can have a big part. But I would say we're already very active there. We held dinners there with premiers of countries already. So a premier of a country would go to our dinner and be there with us and talk about their country's plans for blockchain. That would happen in DC on a visit by them. And, so we're very active together with the various advocacy groups. I think, yes, to answer your question, we will be active and even more active in DC because the US is a super regulator that will shape our industry, not just in the US, but globally. And so that is very important to us in our industry. And we really care about our industry at Chainlink and DeFi as an industry. And it's something that a lot of people here, grew up in and found their success in and are personal users of and care about deeply, as do I. So I think the importance of the US's role in the development will happen. And we need to contribute to that as a community and even me personally, however we can.
Yeah, I want to follow up on the institutional side. DAS happened recently, and I think there's been a huge, as you mentioned, kind of shift towards the institutions. They're not coming, they're here, right? You've been having those conversations frequently alongside conversations with leadership in the regulatory environment. One of the quotes that I kind of took away from DAS recently was, we're going to have USD A to Z. And that may happen if we get stablecoin clarity in legislation, right? We're going to have a lot of private issuers of stables. That's obviously great for, a community like Chainlink, probably great for the industry overall. I'm curious, how do you see that affecting sort of traditional finance? Do you think it's kind of like move over or,
They're going to do it.
If you can't beat them, join them? Yeah.
They're going to join. They're joining. They're joining up big time. They joined. Half of them already joined. Half of them are joining up. That's it. It's, as far as I'm concerned, we won.
Tell us more.
Yeah.
What do we win?
So they all have digital asset teams. Those digital asset teams are big and growing. Look at all the job descriptions out there for the asset managers, for everybody hiring smart contract developers for multiple different chain languages. The only thing holding us back at this point, in my opinion, is that the US institution is highly sensitive to compliance because the amount of fines that they experience from, in many cases, not super well-made rules. I think in certain annual periods globally, the banking sector can experience up to, I think, $100 billion in fines or 80 billion. Something like that.
Some huge number, yeah.
What I saw in research reports. So this is this is why they invest so much in compliance. And the interesting thing about all this is not only does our industry allow them to gain a larger market and successfully compete in that market, but it actually allows them to do their compliance and do their transactions in a more efficient way. So for example, you can automate away certain compliance checks in a way that their failure rate goes way down. That's one of the things, for example, we work on with identity oracles and other things. So the institutions see massive value in this. The size of the crypto market passing 2 trillion, I think locked the most important ones into being part of our industry right there when that happened. There was still a very negative regulatory environment. The regulatory environment, people that don't work with institutions don't fully, I think, understand how much of a signal or how much of a determining factor that is for them. That is, right there after profitability, because it is basically going to be their biggest source of cost, their biggest source of brand risk, their biggest source of risk in general. And the financial industry and the financial world are really about returns versus risk. So if you can eliminate their compliance risk, the regulatory risk, and it's all just profit on the other end, then these places have existed for so long because they're very good at capturing that profit. So I think they all see the profit equation. I think the only thing that's missing is that the risk goes away from a regulatory point of view and from a legal and compliance point of view. I think if there are systems that allow them to comply with a thoughtfully crafted set of rules that actually makes it cheaper and less risky for them to do a transaction of a tokenized equity than it does to do a traditional equity transaction, they will shift to doing all of their transactions in tokenized assets because it is not only more efficient and gives them access to a market and has better properties in terms of settlement, but because it is actually less risky for them to do that. See, that's like a crazy idea right now, but it's absolutely not crazy because we can actually programmatically define and manage risk in the blockchain industry much, much better than in the traditional industry. And their biggest cost and their biggest problem is how to manage risk of compliance, of insolvency. Like I'll give you an example with insolvency. Counterparty risk, one of the most basic problems in the financial system today, where many of the problems and costs and things come from to get around this. Basically, with collateral or the assets, you can't understand who owns what at any one time. You don't know have they owned it or have they given it to someone else? Do they own it and have they pledged it against some set of circumstances, like a CDS or some other swap or something else? And so you can't understand that because all the information is super fragmented and in many different places and it's not synchronized. And this is called the problem of reconciliation. First of all, you can put all this data on a blockchain and everyone's magically reconciled immediately. Second of all, you can use Oracle networks, what Chainlink makes, to synchronize all the data from all the different traditional systems into that blockchain record, creating what we call a unified golden record. And one good example of this is proof of reserves for stablecoins. So if I give you some obligation that gives you access to a treasury, and my treasury ownership is audited annually, there's an annual period in which I could do whatever I want with that treasury, and you wouldn't find out about it for a year, or you won't find out about it if I did it with cash. And this is what happened with Wirecard. One of the biggest failures in the European system is basically the audit timeline was so long and so poorly done that they were able to steal money from the payment system. Now, let's say we take the audit timeline from a year or a quarter or a month to a second. People can steal money in a year or a quarter or a month. I mean, maybe they can steal it in a second, but, that's hard.
Yeah.
And a second later, we're going to know. So this is what I think is going to happen is the financial industry sees an opportunity, but their risk and their ability to comply with regulations is actually much better in our system than the traditional systems. So I think we will just have a massive shift. There will just be a massive shift. And once again, the question for the US is what is the US system's market share as that shift happens. So if we open up, a website that tells us what percentage of stablecoins are backed by US treasuries, right now it's 95% plus. If we open up that interface and we ask ourselves, where are all the tokenized assets from? Or what financial system were they originated in? We want that to be the US system.
Sergey, I want to pivot for the last question we have for you. President Trump's tariffs are clearly in the news right now, and they're having a big effect on the traditional markets. And you recently said that you think some of that could start affecting DeFi as well. That was an interesting point to me because I keep hearing the argument, especially from Bitcoin maxis, that Bitcoin doesn't get tariffed, and that's why Bitcoin isn't going down, although we have seen Bitcoin go down a little bit. ETH doesn't get tariffed because it's not centralized. There's no centralized entity there to get hit by tariffs. So can you expand on your point you made that you think maybe this tariff war will spill over into DeFi?
Yeah, so basically what tariffs are going to do is two things. One thing that they're going to do is they're not going to benefit asset prices in the short term. But what they do to asset prices in the long term isn't completely unclear. I think they will raise inflation, which won't be good, but they have a chance at helping the US government's solvency become greater, right? So in a certain sense, if you care about the US government's solvency, there is some kind of path with tariffs. Asset prices going down is not good for our industry. I think what tariffs are really about is deglobalization. And what happens in an environment of deglobalization is that the few touch points between countries where they are still globalized and they are still interacting with each other become increasingly important. So if there were before 15 touch points between countries that they actively interacted on with each other and they traded and they exchanged information and they did all kinds of transactions, and now you're down to five dimensions on which countries interact with each other in a deglobalized world. Then you have a different value on those five. And DeFi and blockchains and the tokenization of the global financial system is a globalizing force. So if tariffs and deglobalization continue, but DeFi and tokenization of the financial system continues to be a globalizing force, that's actually why DeFi and blockchains and cryptocurrencies are so successful. It's because they're inherently globalized. It's that if you issue some kind of asset or token or something into a traditional financial system, you just get that domestic system. Whereas if you launch a token, you naturally get the global economy. So the blockchain industry is inherently globalized. And it might be that it's one of the few remaining globalized things, which will make it very important. Because globalization as an economic force is extremely, extremely valuable. It might not now be viewed as beneficial to this group or that group, and that's its own set of decisions and ideas that have their various kind of merits and cons and pros and whatever. But it's very clear that whatever is globalized becomes very powerful, because from any one economy, you don't access just your economy. If something is globalized, you access the global economy. And so I think that the fund tokenization, the US financial system tokenization, the Web3 financial system trend that we're now worried about and thinking about from the US point of view is actually one of the most critical trends for whether or not the US has leadership position in this key globalizing force, which is also known as the global financial system. So that's what I think tariffs will do. They will cut away the other touch points between countries, but the few that remain and are truly globalized, like our industry, will become only much more valuable as a result of that, because the transactions and all the value will inherently have to flow through those globalized systems rather than the deglobalized systems, which is a very big deal.
I feel like we had discussed that conversation for hours. But Sergey, the last major thing that we like to ask our guests is, aside from everything we have discussed, what is one other thing that you're watching in DC right now that you think others should pay attention to?
Other than the Nats game, it was good to see at the Nats game on opening day. By the way, that season.
See you there. It was cool. It was fun. I think market structure. So I think stable coins is going to happen. I think the proof of bill is something very interesting and the start of a larger trend of proving things about underlying assets in the US financial system that we're supportive of. But I think market structure is the one that is going to meaningfully shift the regulatory landscape in the most immediate and most consequential way. And I'm very hopeful that can get done before the August recess. And if it can get done before the August recess, and the regulators can make progress off the back of it during this year, then I think our whole industry can change, not just the US financial system or the US adoption of our industry, but our whole industry.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it all pans out. But Sergey, we really appreciate you coming on today, and thank you for sharing all your insights.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergey.